Okay, so I'd like to now review some basic ideas around the concept of motivation. There are numerous theories out there and decades and decades and decades of research around motivation. And I'm not sure that there's actually any consensus on, where we all stand on this thing. I still think it's relatively open to conversation and debate. So, but what I'd like to do is call this particular segment ideas or things to consider around the issue of motivation. There's some basic questions. Can you actually motivate an individual? That's still, I think, in debate whether it's whether we actually can control or motivate other people's behavior. Some people feel very strongly yes. Some may not feel that way. And then there's the question about why we think we need to motivate employees. And if we are able to, what is it indeed that does motivate them? So there are some research, some great amount of research that says this idea of effort is of primary concern, is how do we influence effort? And that somehow the belief is that the more effort someone puts into their position, the more performance we will get, and at the end of that, the more reward that would come back to the individual, which is basically bucketed under this idea of reinforcement. So it gets somewhat complicated. So effort is obviously influenced by other things. So, for example, if we believe that effort leads to performance, leads to rewards, the perception that performance leads to rewards on behalf of the individual would need to be high. The rewards would need to be valued. There also needs to be a perception that effort actually leads to performance. So in any of these situations, the perception that effort leads to performance, the perception that performance leads to rewards, that all needs to be clear in relation to how much effort somebody would put into a role, into a task. These are also influenced once effort is once somebody puts effort into a thing, into a task, then these are sort of moderated by things like the person's ability or the person's clarity about what needs to be done. So this is where your selection of the right people and bringing in the right skills into the organization becomes important. It's also, implications here to your training and development. In terms of what happens to effort leading to performance. And then if we were to take this out further, then if performance leads to rewards, theoretically, if the rewards are deemed equitable by the people, then combined with the rewards would lead to satisfaction on behalf of the employee, which then feeds back into the cycle, that perception of effort actually leading to performance, and that these rewards are indeed valued. So there's one complex way of looking at a motivational system. There are many theories out there. I'm sure you've all seen the hierarchy of needs as a theory, in that folks will be climb a ladder, if you will, of motivation, based on needs being satisfied, the low level being physiological, then safety, then social, all the way up through self-esteem and self-actualization. There's lots of debate. Is this a heavily researched idea? I mean, it does make some sense, but usually when you're in the employment world, people come in to do a job, if you will. So in a way, people who are currently working, for the most part, have a place to live, a way to commute, to get to work, and those kinds of things. So, this particular idea of the hierarchy of needs, I'm not sure exactly how relevant it is to managers of people, but it's it's out there. There are simplified versions of this out there, so I just put it out there. It's a theory of motivation. Other research and theories revolve around this idea of equity, meaning that there's some constant of rewards that happens through some simple formula that says, the relationship between my input and my output leads to some performance, and that should be connected to my rewards. This is somewhat related to the reinforcement theorists. So, a commissioned salesperson, for example, would be somebody, the more I put in, the more I get out, and I can actually have control over my reward system. So that, is one application of this. Another thing I noticed way back when I was doing my summer jobs early in my job career, when I was actually putting myself through college, I remembered a curious thing that occurred. On payday, is the workers in the factory that I was working in, they would compare paychecks with each other, and they would show each other their stubs, and in a way it was to sort of get everybody on the same page that, hey, we're all being treated fairly, we're all being treated equitably, if you will. And I always found that curious. It was sort of a way for the factory worker to keep management in check, if you will. So I did find that a curious thing, but it played out right in front of my eyes. So equity, something to consider. Actually, when I was my early jobs in human resources, one of my responsibility was related to employee data, and in that case, I would run statistics based on numbers of people in certain job classifications, job levels. I would run compensation statistics and performance review statistics, and I would break it down under the classic categories of ethnicity, race, gender, those kinds of things. And so companies, at least as I was growing up in my career, paid attention to this idea of equity, and that certain classifications and groups would be treated equitably. So there's something to be said. At least there's a strong belief that equity has something to do with motivation. As things have evolved, and I'm sure all of you in the audience, when you go to your jobs, you see the idea of goals, and goal setting has become really a major way of getting individuals to perform. There's some connection with the clarity of goals with motivation and performance, and you'll see different models out there about goal setting. In this case, you'll see what are goals. Goals should be specific, challenging, attainable, participative, and then in terms of how you plan and make goals, and include a feedback loop. And not a surprise that goal setting would be a part of the thinking around motivation. So if we were to kind of summarize those theories that we've talked about thus far, we can sort of make some assumptions that performance and the value of rewards have some relationship to effort. We can assume that feedback is important, that there's some closed loop to see that the assumptions that people are making about the relationship between performance and rewards and effort and performance, that those are clear. We see that that ability and role clarity are obviously related to performance, and that reward fulfillment and equity are related to satisfaction. So these sort of things are good assumptions that we could make. I'm using in this last case the word satisfaction intentionally because there's many schools of thought in the research that say satisfaction and motivation are not the same thing, and that satisfaction can be something very positive and improve performance. There are some studies that say satisfaction may not do that. So it's a lot of this stuff is still open-ended. If we look here at these two lists that I have, list 1 and 2, the columns, you'll see list one is achievement, recognition, feedback, interesting work, responsibility, and challenge. On the second list, salary, benefits, working conditions, supervision, policies, relationship, promotions, status, and advancement. So these actually are indicative of very different views of motivation. The list on the right is sort of what we've been talking about thus far. These would be extrinsic motivators. So I will perform to get some tangible reward, which is outside of the context of the position. So, for example, your benefit plan has nothing to do with your actual job. Promotions down the road may not have anything to do with how you're doing your job right now. So these are sort of outside of the position, if you will, and that's called extrinsic motivation, that I will do something, I will perform to secure something like a better salary down the road, or maybe stronger relationships, or maybe a promotion, or some advancement, or some status in the organization, etc. Even things like working conditions. People will leave jobs because of the situation they're in. It could be whether in a not enough light, or too much noise, or too open and not enough privacy, whatever it is. They could leave for policy. Again, those are not embedded inside a job description. Whereas the list on the left, this idea of achieving something on your job, getting feedback specifically about what you've done on the job, that your work is interesting, that you're taking on responsibility and challenge, that you're lit up about the position that you're working on, that you take pride in it, that you identify with it. This is a different form of motivation. This is internal. Intrinsic motivation is what this was referred to. And theoretically, this is what leaders want. They want people to come to the jobs really wanting to, perform just because it helps them, internally feel better. It creates energy. So the interesting thing about these two lists is that there are some theories that say that if you put too much emphasis on extrinsic motivators, it actually will diminish why people do what they do. It diminishes intrinsic motivation. So if I make everything related to, say, piecemeal, or if I make everything related to, like in a commission status, then my focus is on obtaining the extrinsic reward and less on the intrinsic reward. Whereas if there's some kind of a separation of these concepts, so if, for example, day to day, so a salaried person, for example, who doesn't really get a review maybe once a year, there's really no way that you can say, I'm doing my job because I might get a good raise down the road. So in that particular case, there are some schemes of management that are sort of disconnecting the rewards from the position, in an indirect way, I guess you could say. And the theory there is that if they're disconnected, people will go into jobs that they are more interested in. And you'll see this, you see many, many people, I'm sure who take jobs that may not have the best pay, may not have the best working conditions, but they really love what they are doing, whether it be a teacher or an occupational therapist, or you name, just go through the list. It could be certainly people in professional settings where people, accountants, but people who come to work because they love the work that they are doing. So this is sort of an important concept, this idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and something that managers should really need to come to grips with. I know in a previous session we talked about leadership, and particularly situational leadership, and this idea of motivation is clearly linked into that idea. So when structuring, motivational strategies, given all these things that we've talked about to this point, there's a lot of ways you can go with this. The idea of a contract, with employees, a psychological contract around effort, performance, rewards, or goal setting, or whatever theory you buy into. The idea of recognition is very, very important in context of motivational strategies. Rewards and reward systems, enriching a job, giving people more responsibility and more interesting. Having people participate is a with you with the setting of goals and things like that. Can certainly be part of a motivational strategy. Peer pressure works. When you're, especially in a competitive environment, it absolutely can play a large role. And if nothing else, as you're going through a change process, some peers, quote unquote, get it before others. So having that in place can help people move along through a change process more quickly. And acknowledgement of individual needs certainly can be considered. So, for example, flex time, job sharing, things like that could be very helpful in putting together a motivational strategy. So, as a summary, there's no easy answers when it comes to motivation. There are many folks out there who, and we talked about situational leadership in another segment, but the idea of readiness from the standpoint of the employee and the workplace is certainly where things seem to be moving. So the readiness to take an action will lead to an action, which will lead to a result, and those results will have feedback loops and consequences embedded in them. From the employee perspective, readiness can be direction needed about what to do, so goals and processes and policies. There are motivational issues such as this need to feel competent, which seems to be a real driver of motivation. There seems to be more and more around that, is that people feel, if they feel competent on a job and in control of their ability to drive results, that seems to be really the two key factors related to motivation, self-assertion, and seeking and conquering challenges. So those are all things related to the motivational readiness of a person. And of course, there are the skills and abilities which we spoke about earlier. In terms of readiness in the workplace, it's good to take a look at the job at hand organizationally, whether things are resourced properly or if there are any opportunities for improvement or change. So bucketing this under the idea of performance technology as it relates to motivation. Again, these are nothing definitive here. These are things that you should be considering as a leader, and I hope this made some sense to you, and I look forward to having more conversation